Okay, well, welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. We are a monthly gathering of both skeptics and believers who respectfully discuss important books from both perspectives. My name is James Walker. I'm the co-founder, along with Bill Cluck. I'm the Christian half of the equation. I am the president of Watchman Fellowship, an apologetics Christian organization. These are our offices here. The book club's been going now for how long, Bill? 2.5 years? 2.5, yeah, going on 3 in a couple months now, so 3 years almost, and we are got more and more in recent clubs. We've had the authors present with us. We either try to Skype them in, and so they can interact with us in advance, or in the case of tonight, we have the authors with us. So Bill Cluck is the other co-founder. He's a former Christian, now atheist. Bill, would you give us the title of tonight's book and introduce our two authors?
The Story of the Cosmos is the name of the book. And Daniel, our very own Daniel Ray, is a former middle and high school teacher and lay astronomer, and holds an MA in Christian apologetics from Houston Baptist University. Under the direction of Michael Ward, Daniel completed his thesis on the contemporary relevance of C.S. Lewis's cosmological imagination in the Chronicles of Narnia. The Story of the Cosmos is part of a professional and personal dream of creating a Christian response to the widely popular Cosmos series, which you're all familiar with, of Carl Sagan. Daniel also does a monthly podcast with Wayne Spencer about faith and wonders about the universe. Patreon.com/goodheavens. Alan here, England, holds a bachelor's in physics from the University of Texas at Austin, a master's equivalent degree in software and systems engineering from UT's Continuing Engineering Studios, where he also later taught. He also has taught many courses at Raytheon and one recently at the College of Southwestern. He's a former E Fellow at Raytheon, where he has been his team responsible for image processing for the world's first high-resolution commercial imaging satellite. Alan is currently self-employed developing algorithms on imagery. He has led a Reasonable Faith chapter at UT Dallas since 2010 and regularly speaks on fine-tuning. These guys are pretty smart.
Yeah. Well, what we're going to do is, before we get into this book, I have a couple of housekeeping things to do. I sometimes forget, but I try to remember to kind of get an idea of a couple of just where we are as far as who's here. Like I say, check the Lamb's Book of Life real quickly. So how many of you are here that are Christian? Raise your hand. Okay. The majority this time? It looks like. Okay, how many here are atheist or agnostic? If you raise your, well, no, that's close to even. Okay.
Anybody raise their hand twice?
Undecided with the same sign, or
that counts.
Maybe we might have some Muslims or something else. I don't know, but that's we usually go about half and half. I think last month we had more atheists than, or the month before I think we had more atheists than Christians. But anyway, we come from both perspectives, and what I want to do also before we get into this book, and I've got a lot of good questions. I know you do too. Is I want to go ahead and do some housekeeping on talking about next month. Now we're changing the date on next month, so instead of the first Friday, we're going to be on the second Saturday of November, and our book is going to be Pale Blue Dot by the late Carl Sagan. The book was recommended to us by one of our members, Dick. I don't know if he's here, but yeah, right there. And we were actually thinking about another Carl Sagan book, but this one, I've already listened to the audio of, I think, the first 7 chapters. It's I think a great counterpoint for their book, for the Story of the Cosmos. And so we're going to be looking at that book. The reason that we're postponing and having it on November 9th is this gives us an opportunity to have a very special guest by way of Skype. And no, we're not having Carl Sagan. He's none of us here believe in seances. I don't.
He's coming back with Elvis.
Jim and I will do a Ouija board, and you can ask Carl anything you want.
But this is actually a really good get, I think, on who our guest is going to be. Our guest is going to be Sasha Sagan, the daughter of Carl Sagan.
Oh, wow.
And she's going to be joining us by Skype, so it's going to be very important that you kind of get a head start on the book, and that you're able to have questions that we can ask her. She's also written her own book, and we can't do that one because it's not out yet, but hopefully in a future Atheist and Christian Book Club. We might be looking at her book, For Small Creatures Such as We, Finding Wonder and Meaning in Our Unlikely World. And that meaning part, I think, would be something I'd really like to talk to her about. And we got this lined up through Daniel Ray. Daniel has contacted her. They've got some interaction going, and she seems to be, you said, a delightful.
She's awesome.
Awesome. Okay.
She's awesome.
And so that's going to be, I think, really, really good. This book is kind of a book-length thing that came out of an article she wrote for New York Magazine. And it was very well read, very well received, very popular. And it talked about her interaction with her father and how her father helped her to kind of develop a philosophy of life and the importance of incorporating ritual into her daily life. And so I'm looking forward to her book as well. So be sure to read that and have that in. Now, if you look on the back of your handout, we tell you how to get copies of several ways you can get copies of Pale Blue Dot, paperback through Amazon, Kindle. There's also the audiobook available. This next section on YouTube, I located this and put a kind of a jump link to it. But on YouTube, they have a video of the first 2 chapters, like a little mini documentary of chapter 1 and chapter 2 that you can watch. And then the rest of the audio book is for the remainder of the chapter. So if you go to this YouTube link at watchman.org/paleblue, that playlist is going to give you the whole book for free. Either you can watch it or listen to every chapter of it. So this is a good way to get a head start. So, and also you'll be able to RSVP on that by tomorrow. So get your, to be able to get that in. So that's going to be our book for November, and then in December, I dreaded this, but everybody kept saying they wanted to do one of my books. I don't feel like my books are very good for the club. I mean, it's not the topic that we like to deal with here. But in the spirit of Christmas, I decided to go ahead and do that. So in December 6th, we'll be looking at a book I co-authored called The Truth Behind the Secret. It's based on something called the Law of Attraction. Rhonda Byrne. Oprah's a big fan of this. This should be a kumbaya moment, because I think all of us in this room are going to agree this is, I'm just going to say not true. I'm going to say this is probably not true. But it's very, very powerful. There's been 2 sequels to the book come out, and it's still, very, very popular topic and issue. So we're going to do this book. And also in the spirit of Christmas and grace, I'm going to be giving away my book, or you get your choice, or the audio of my book. So you get the full book, and if you, on the shelf out by Jim, if you'll kind of stand and do a point motion like...
Vanna White?
Yeah, Vanna White. Vanna White. There you go for me. You can feel free to pick up one or the other. I think we have enough for everybody to be able to do that out there, and you can get a head start on that book as well. And it really, the worldview that's being dealt with here is the kind of a variation of pantheism. So it's not atheism, it's not theism. That's all we talk about. It's really this deals with pantheism. So anyway, hope that you enjoy that. So what we're dealing with as our book today, though, is we're talking about the story of the cosmos. And how many co-authors were involved total?
13.
13 contributors?
12.
12 contributors?
Yeah, gosh, that's a hard question.
I should have warned you I was going to ask that, right? So get your
12.
calculator.
12.
12, okay, 12 of them. And we have 2 of the co-authors here with us. We've also had interaction in the book club with at least one of the other co-authors, Melissa Kane Travis. So if I could just maybe start off with Alan, and how did you get involved in the project, and your chapters, what do they focus on?
Yeah, I'm thankful that Dan Ray gave me the opportunity. I was like, when I found out about the book, I was like, well, are you doing something on fine tuning within the book? And at that point they hadn't. And then it was like, well, let's involve Luke Barnes. He's one of the world's foremost experts in fine tuning. And I asked Luke, do you want to write the chapter, or do you want to write it together? And he said, yeah, let's do it together. And they were cool with that, so we ended up writing it together. So yeah, the fine tuning, do you want me to give a little bit of a synopsis?
Yeah, just a short one.
Sure. we make the case that's very widely accepted among physicists that light-permitting physics is rare among possibilities. If you look at the fundamental particles of the universe, turns out tiny, tiny changes in the mass of certain particles would render the whole universe lifeless. And there's other constants that would have just ruined it, the rate of expansion. It's very finely tuned based on a cosmological constant. And it turns out almost everything you've heard of has to be finely tuned in some way, or we wouldn't have life. And so this seems very surprising on atheism, but not unsurprising on theism, and therefore constitutes some evidence for God. Is the basic synopsis. We started off with a quote by Richard Dawkins, where he says, you guys have probably all heard this, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. And the thing that we agree with them about the principle of looking at what is the universe like, how does it compare to what you expect on atheism and theism. That's a good way to evaluate theories, such as is done in science all the time. But the key thing is he starts with DNA, and there's a lot that has to happen before DNA is even possible in the universe. In order to have orderly structures, you have to have all this fine tuning. Because DNA has things like carbon and nitrogen, and you have to have very special things happening in nuclear fusion to allow for those elements.
Hey, James.
I'm sorry. There are two new visitors driving around trying to find their way in outside. Can I get out this door?
No, you gotta go here.
Yeah, yeah, I should have unlocked that. Let me see. Actually, let me see if you can just go ahead and do that. Take my key and see if you can get out that way.
We're good.
I'm good.
Yeah.
I'm not moving.
Trash.
Okay. And also, if you could, Daniel, if you could, a little bit about just real briefly
Yeah.
on how your contribution and how you got involved in the project.
So after I graduated HBU, I asked my thesis. I had met a Hubble Space Telescope astrophysicist during my research for my MA, my master's, and I stayed in touch with him. And I asked Dr. Ward, who's in the chapter, who's a C.S. Lewis expert, if he would like to do a presentation about C.S. Lewis and Narnia alongside Dr. Kokomar, who's a Hubble expert. So we had C.S. Lewis and Narnia and the Hubble Space Telescope in one night. It was the coolest thing ever. I didn't think they were going to do it. We raised the money. We planned it for a couple of years. And that's how I met Paul Gould. I was just looking for a place to have it. I was just looking for an auditorium. And Paul liked the idea so much, he said, let's do a book, Dan. I'm like, no, I don't want to do a book. I just want to have this. These people are super busy. I don't want to have a book. I actually turned down, I didn't know who Paul Gould was. I actually turned down Paul's offer at first to do the book. But then we had over 200 people show up for it. It was pin drop silent when Dr. Kokomar was speaking. We didn't videotape it, but it was one of those things where if you were there, how many of you, anybody here was there? Nobody? Okay, it was awesome. But I finally capitulated. I was like, okay, I'll write a book. I didn't know who Paul was, but so the book was Paul's idea, and so between he and I, we got contacts. We knew people, and pretty soon we had our authors in about a weekend agree to contribute an essay, and there are 14 people. I'm sorry because I forgot you and Luke were tag team. So, but that's how the story came together, combining science and imagination. Two things I love, which is the universe, cosmology, Hubble Space Telescope, which is like, yeah, and C.S. Lewis and Narnia, which is something I enjoy as well. So my two loves coming together. The book came out of this, and it's like literally like a miracle and a dream come true. And it just continues to be an amazing adventure because now I'm in contact with Carl Sagan's daughter, which is just like, she's sending me a book and I'm sending her a book. And it's just, it's remarkable. And I never in a million years had saw that coming when I made the suggestion to Michael and Anton about the event. So that's how the book came together.
Great. Bill, I think you had a quote you were interested in.
Well, first of all, I really enjoyed the book. It was well written. It's a beautiful book, guys. I mean, just wonderful. And
the artwork and illustrations.
binary stars. Who knew there were 60% of the universe? I learned a lot from it. But there were a couple quotes, couple people like St. Augustine, the other guy who's very dear to my heart. I'll just, there'll be a question afterwards. So, considered in its totality, the universe is a well-ordered harmony. Each part, too, is beautiful. While humans are a little piece of your creation, they are created with a great dignity and value as God's image bearers, because, as Augustine famously proclaimed, you have made us for yourself. And here's the guy that's dear to my heart. Let's fast forward a millennium and consider the words of reformer John Calvin. The universe, according to Calvin, is God's stage, a dazzling theme in which the glory is on full display. Wherever you cast your eyes, there is no spot in the universe wherein you cannot discern at least some sparks of the glory. Looking up into the night sky evokes awe of the Creator who stationed, arranged, and fixed together the starry host of heavens in such a wonderful order that nothing mere beautiful in appearance can be imagined. When considering the human person, God is seen there too. Man is a microcosm, a rare example of God's power, goodness, and wisdom. For Calvin, the universe and its denizens function like a mirror in which we can contemplate God who is otherwise invisible. Man sees God in creation, and seeing God, he finds himself in his place too. That's what you get when you have a French lawyer who becomes a theologian. Brilliant guy. But my one criticism would be one word: incredulity. You look at this universe and it's like incredulous. Just like when I was in the Atheist book club, they told me a rainbow is just a refraction. The raindrops act as mirrors, and it's just a refraction. Well, thanks for killing my rainbow thing. But how would you guys answer that criticism that the argument seems to speak of incredulity?
What do you specifically have in mind? Like you just can't believe it was created?
Well, it's just the universe. The distances with the universe are so mind-boggling.
It's too big to be created.
That it just we instead of just let's look at this objectively, go. It's so incredulous that we, are.
Yeah, I think for me personally, I think the idea is, of course, in my opening chapter I talk about the heavens declare the glory of God. And glory in Hebrew is kavod, which means something like it's a hard word to translate. It means heaviness. It means like a kind of like wealth and renown and solemnity when you're in the presence of a king. If you've ever read David McCullough's account of John Adams meeting King George III after the Revolutionary War, that is kavod. You need to read that if you haven't. It's great. Just being in the presence of the majesty, the grace, the power, who this person is. And so the capaciousness is what I call it, the capaciousness of the universe. To me, exemplifies many different invisible attributes of God's capaciousness, his character, his power, his magnificence, his glory. And so the size, which is, as you say, I'm mind-boggled, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying I comprehend these distances with any ease.
Who could?
It's incredible. But I think to me that, because I live out in dark skies and I stargaze where I live, and just contemplating the majesty, actually incarnately contemplating what's above me, just the beauty and the awe. Scripture likens the fixed order of the heavens to God's new covenant in Jeremiah, and so you have this, and this is the thing, Bill. I think that our minds are kind of blinded to the idea of the cosmos. And so when you add the cosmos, the special and the general revelation together, you get a much bigger, more comprehensive picture of who God is, I think.
Well, and you've heard the expression, there's as many suns as there are grains of sand on all the beaches of the world.
More stars than sun.
I mean, just think of like Myrtle Beach or Galveston down here. And all those little grains, when I go to the beach, and it's just, I mean, don't you think that's overkill on God's part?
I think. Well, it's not if your resources are limited, sure. But God doesn't operate with a budget. He doesn't go to Home Depot. Yeah, he doesn't have a house budget. But I heard doing research for the book, you run into all kinds of things. But it was Alan, maybe you can have heard about this. But I think it was 2012 or 2016, NASA came out with a revitalized estimation from all the Hubble galaxy pictures they've had. And the 2016 data suggested, both observational and theoretical, that there are 2 trillion galaxies in the universe.
Not stars, but galaxies.
Not stars, but galaxies.
Yeah, it seems to keep growing over
Yeah,
time.
it just keeps getting bigger and bigger.
Well, and Richard Carrier said, he was here before, he said, the universe is like this room, and, this is where we are, the Earth. Why is there so much wasted space? And here's the thing, when you look at the sun, it's 8 light minutes away. That's 8 light minutes. When you look at the nearest star, it's 4,000 light years. So that's
4 light years.
4
4 light years.
Alpha
But that
Centauri.
is like light travels at 186,000 miles a second. So the sun is only 8 light minutes, and that's 93 million miles away. Just think of Andromeda Galaxy, that's 2 million light years away, that when we were first, Homo sapiens were first crawling on the Earth, that light was just beginning to get here and took 2 million years. It's just, the distances are just unbelievable.
Well,
I think we had a question or comment over here too,
Well, I was
maybe.
just gonna say, I understand, I know Bill's dying, I always give it, but I'm also thinking it's the flip side to that, is why would God have all that space? This is too much, it's too much. Or if it is created for his pleasure, why is there just as little as we know? Because if God is infinite and omnipotent and omnipresent, just what we know would be nothing to him.
True.
So you can look at it from two sides.
To Ron in just a second, but I just want to say, one of the things that, and I think this month and next month, I'd really like to explore this whole theme. One thing I noticed, like I said, I've listened through the first 7 chapters of Sagan's book, Pale Blue Dot, and it seems like that everybody's looking at the same evidence and coming to the exact opposite conclusion on that. So it's almost like your worldview determines your hermeneutic. Whatever your worldview is going to be how you interpret the data you're looking at.
Yeah.
So we've discussed this back and forth to some extent, the whole size question. And I think there's a lot of straw manning going on. The perspective that I have on it, and it's informed by my recent gained understanding of Bayes' theorem. Say, for example, that you have a die in front of you, a 6-sided die, and there's 2 people. One has a hypothesis that the die is loaded. The other has a hypothesis that the die is fair, right? So the guy who has the hypothesis that it's loaded says, well, it's loaded for evens. So if you roll the die, there's a 90% chance that it will hit an even number. The other guy says, no, it's fair, so I predict a 50-50 chance. So they roll the die, and it's even, right? So according to Bayes' theorem, the fact that it was even is a prediction of the non-fair die hypothesis. So that counts as evidence against the person who said it was a fair die. You can't tell for sure, it's all probabilities, but so far, just with one roll of the die, you already have a basis for saying that's evidence against the fair die hypothesis. Now, if you keep rolling it 2, 3, 4, 5 times and it keeps being even, then the evidence mounts for the non-fair hypothesis. And I'm saying all this because under the hypothesis that God created the universe, you don't know what's in God's mind. You don't know ahead of time to expect or to predict whether the universe should be big or small. It could be big, it could be small, it could be medium. You have no basis ahead of time for saying whether it should be bigger or small. Are you with me on that? Mm-hmm. Okay, so, but according to a naturalistic hypothesis, in order for life to get off the ground, you need a bogglingly large universe for that to even be possible, right? So naturalism would predict that the universe has to be big, right? So it's not. So it's like rolling one die, one roll of the die, and the outcome is that yes, it's big. So that was a prediction of naturalism. So right there, you have evidence against the hypothesis.
Okay, there's a certain amount of sense to that.
So what do y'all think?
Yeah, I think, I do a lot with Bayes' theorem in my work, and that was a good explanation. But the thing is, on naturalism, I don't think it's a very strong prediction that the universe would be huge. Namely because most of these multiverse theories, they're trying to explain how you can have a Big Bang originate. And actually, most of them would predict much smaller universes. Like if you read Eugene Koonen's book, Many Worlds in One and so forth, they're very explicit that these kind of theories actually predict smaller universes. And so you have then Roger Penrose speaking about how, there's all this orderliness in the early universe. It's an example of fine-tuning. And he says the multiverse is worse than useless for explaining that because the universe is so big. So I see it as actually the opposite.
So wouldn't you need a lot of suns and a lot of planets to find a planet that's just the right position relative to the sun, the right kind of rotation and so forth, the right size? You got to have a huge number of.
Well, what if you had a huge number of universes, each of which were small? That's what these multiverse theories predict, and that's the problem, is they don't look anything like our universe.
Well, let's talk about something that is reality. Black holes. And there's a girl, Sarah Salamander, who
Salvian.
sorry. She said that she became a Christian because of the wonder of black holes. But guys, you can't have it both ways. On page 209, if you turn your Bibles here, it says at the end of right before inflation, most of the alternative histories of the universe don't involve anything remotely resembling life or even complexity. They consist of black holes, simple, useless, and dead. Black holes, if you guys don't know, suck in everything. They're destructive things. I mean, Daniel, I had a little talk. He believes they have some benefit as like vacuum cleaners and so forth. But Richard Kerrigan says the universe seems to be designed for black holes, and we were discussing how every galaxy has a black hole. So why in the world, with something so destructive as a black hole, that light, the gravitational force is so strong, light can't even escape from them, and they're really dense. Like something this size would weigh 600 pounds. I mean, it's just incredible. So do you all know?
First of all, maybe I don't know who could speak to this or anything, but I'm not positive on that. Virtually every galaxy at the center of the galaxy has either a black hole or had a black hole, right? And so if that's true, is there something inherent about galaxies that they're required to have a black hole?
It's an artifact of the ways that galaxies tend to form. But actually, this comment ties very directly in with the comment I've just made, because the fine-tuning of the orderliness of the early universe is necessary to avoid what Sarah was referring to there, a universe so dominated by black holes that you wouldn't have the possibility of life. So in fact, the universe is not set up to maximize black holes. It's quite the opposite. You need this exquisite fine-tuning to minimize the number of black holes.
So the Beatles were right. The sea of holes. It was really kind of that bizarre.
But again, it's this incredulity argument. Sarah goes and she's walking to class and she goes, "Oh my gosh, it all makes sense. You know, I'm a believer." You know.
Well, I think what she was, my understanding of what she was saying is a lot of it was that it is just the way that you. It was so difficult for scientists to even accept the possibility of black holes. So because it was so counterintuitive, and she identified those 4 different human weaknesses,
limited
perspective, pride, what were the others?
Emotions and intellectual inertia, lack of humility.
You're accusing us of that?
No,
Really?
she's saying,
No, she's
saying
saying all humans have
human
this
nature.
has this
Human
issue.
nature.
And I think the lessons she learned from black holes, not that black holes, the fact they exist proves there must be a God. I don't think that was her point at all. That the fact that scientists had so much difficulty even setting aside their prejudice to consider the possibility that, because it's so counterintuitive, that there was lessons to be learned that because they couldn't touch it or fathom it or reason it out, they couldn't exist. And despite the math and everything, and you would finally have, some scientists, she took you through the history of now it's the accepted reality at this point. But to get there, you had to overcome this. And she said that's how she feels like that people are when it comes to God. That you can't even consider it rationally because it's so counterintuitive and so runs against the grain on these 4 areas of human weakness, and that's what she wrestled with as an atheist. Mm-hmm. And then she said, if scientists had so much difficulty accepting black holes, which we now know is true, could we be doing the same thing?
Well, I've heard Chris on YouTube at Atheist Edge, and he's very objective. You don't have any of those weaknesses, do you?
No whatsoever.
So, what do you think of the book, Chris?
Well, since Alan was here, I'd be interested to talk about fine-tuning, since that was his chapter. Part of my issue with the fine-tuning argument, and you kind of addressed this a little bit, and maybe I kind of didn't get the gist of what you were going for. I'm not sure how that's not a God of the gaps argument, because it seems like the question is, we have all these constants that need to be just so, and we don't know how they got to be just so. And I guess the current naturalistic argument would be something about multiverse, which is maybe inadequate, or just plain we don't know. And the theistic answer is God did it, and that's
So is it
God
God
gaps.
Well, they're really, it's not appealing to any gaps in our knowledge. It's just looking at our best understood physical theories, quantum mechanics, standard model, particle physics, etc., and just looking at what we know from within those.
Like the
there is
quarks
no-
have to be, if they were a little bit bigger, you wouldn't get.
Yeah, the quark masses, electron mass, all these different things have to be just right for life. There's sort of a series of patterns that are unexplained on naturalism. There is no underlying theory that demands that the mass of electron be a certain mass. It seems to have a wide range of possibilities up to the so-called Planck mass. But it has this only within that there's this narrow range that would permit life.
But the guy you interviewed, Alan, said the cosmological constant doesn't have to be within certain parameters. It has a lot more fudge factor. Did he not admit that?
Well, Luke Barnes
Luke Barnes,
has
yeah.
done the galaxy formation simulations on the cosmological constant. But you have to realize that the fine-tuning of that is at least 1 part in 10 to the 90th power.
See, when you use these numbers, 10 to the 90th, that's like zeros out there.
Can I throw in a little calculation here? Because we're not talking, I don't think, God of gaps, we're talking probabilities.
You're right.
I think. So the thing is, let's say, okay, we got this approximately 3 meter by 4 meter wall. Okay, if you divide, there's 1 square millimeter that is the universe, that the factors that will actually do that. So you're blind. Okay, I'm going to give you a dart, and you're going to have to hit that one spot there, and
More
you're
like
blind. And
one
you're blind.
atom in the whole universe.
Okay, yeah, no, okay, well that's just the start, because okay, you do that and you're blindfolded. You have to throw it there. Okay, now you do these things, and you have to do that, hit the right one 428 times in a row, and then you're starting to approximate.
Yeah, because
the
there's like 2,
possibilities.
as Hugh Ross, you
Yeah.
guys are familiar with them, said there's
Yeah.
like 200 of
So-
these,
Yeah, rate of
constants.
expansion, just to get that right,
Yeah.
but that's only one of the many other things you have to get right. in a row.
Exactly. I mean, and you could figure out these things. Maybe you're going to have to do it 500 times instead of
And the
428.
mass density of the universe, if it's
Yeah.
off by.
But see,
Hugh Ross-
what that shows is that this is not random. I think that's the thing. If
Well,
it was
obviously,
random, we
yeah.
could. Yeah, okay. So the non-randomness, I think we could say this is a fact, really. But then where does it come from?
And you can have, I mean, colloquially, I'm not heavy into the philosophy of it, but I more see the God of the gaps in terms of, if you make coffee, you can explain coffee by a coffee maker. You can explain the mechanics of a coffee maker, and that's a perfectly legitimate explanation. Or boiling water, or a French press. You can explain a number of different technical ways to make coffee, and they're perfectly legitimate explanations. But that technical explanation does not ever rule out the barista or the person who made the coffee. Now, it may be an inadequate philosophical or scientific explanation to say, Mom made coffee for me, but it's a perfectly legitimate reason for believing that that's why the coffee is on the table. Now, there are other mechanical details that go into, that a child wouldn't understand about how to make coffee, but the two reasons are legitimate, and they don't cancel each other out. So you can have a mechanistic explanation of
And that makes sense, but
Yeah.
like Jim, for example, has been, by your own admission, you're very impressed by the fine-tuning argument, right?
Yes.
So why don't you believe there's
It's
something?
not satisfactory enough based on the only 2 counters I have to it are, albeit very weak evidence. I wish I had something better. Is the weak anthropic principle and the
Okay, Todd, we talked about, what's the weak anthropic?
It's Douglas Adams. Anyone ever read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy?
Yes.
You know the puddle in the.
42.
This is the best way to explain it. There's a puddle and it's got an intelligence and it fills up this little hole and he's looking around and he's saying, "Oh, I'm this puddle," and it just so happens that I perfectly fit in this hole, and it's like this hole was meant for me because I fit in it just so right. And as the sun starts to bake him down and he starts evaporating, he doesn't realize that he disappears and.
Well, now Daniel
Yeah,
actually, they asked this question to Daniel in his video, and he said the universe is not a puddle, right?
Yeah, that's. I mean, I think I completely understand what Adams is trying to get at, but you have some trade-off. No analogy is perfect, but you have a trade-off that you're comparing a puddle to the universe. I mean that it's. I get the analogy, but I think there's a significant breakdown in what's being compared. I think it's a kind of apples and oranges. Adams for Doug Adams. That's a great book. I mean, he was a,
Sure.
a
And
skeptic.
the other thing
but-
is, in any scientific study, you want a large sample size. That's like the number one thing you want.
Yeah.
We have a sample size of 1. We have nothing to compare this universe to because we only have this universe as our sample. So when Alan, before this the meeting started, we were talking about, and he said it again just now, life, but he never continues with life as we know it. Who knows what other forms of whatever, what is life and how many other ways could there be life? If you tweak all the parameters a certain way, what is that?
Yeah, because like carbon is wonderful way to create life, but how about if we were silicon-based, we'd be saying, man, silicon's a great way to make life.
Let me respond to those because those have been addressed. For example, in this Cambridge University Press book by Luke Barnes and an atheist, highly recommend this, by the way. They both agree on basically all the physics except for one footnote, but they have different views on how to interpret it. But the thing they agree on is that, I'm mixing in my mind. I want to respond to the puddle one first. So even a skeptic like David Deutsch, the Oxford philosopher, he says that's all washed up with respect to fine tuning, because if you think about a puddle, any shape would hold water. Okay, it doesn't matter what the shape is, the way the physics works out, the water is going to be pushed down by gravity and kind of fill it up to some level. Whereas the universe, what we've discovered is that not any configuration of physics, both in terms of initial conditions, laws, constants, is going to be life-supporting. So it's very disanalogous actually to the fine-tuning.
At life as we know it, though.
Yeah, that's the other one that I wanted to respond to. They respond to that by talking about how, like, if the cosmological constant were different by more than 1 part in 10 to the 90th power, that there's just no chance for even complexity, any form of life whatsoever, because you would literally have no atoms other than, you'd have hydrogen, I suppose, protons, but they would be like billions of miles apart before they would even touch each other. You would just have the universe flying apart rapidly.
I'll say one more thing and I'll shut up. I didn't want to talk a lot because there's so many people here, but
No, those are good-
I
good
want to
things
get
to
your
talk
all's
about.
views on, because how many extraterrestrial Goldilocks planets have we found? Like 300-ish right now? Are we at 300 right now?
We found hundreds, maybe 1,000
Okay.
planets,
If,
depending on.
hypothetically, if you or Daniel were, would it change any of your views if we found, forget basic life, let's say intelligent as us or higher life on one of these Goldilocks planets?
Absolutely not. I see no
You wouldn't change
prediction from theism necessarily to.
Let me
Weigh
ask you
in
a
on
counter
that.
question to that. If, come to find out, there was actually intelligent life on a planet of every star, come to find out, would that mean the universe wasn't too big after all?
Well, I didn't make that argument.
That's something to think about.
What if, just following your example, and then we get to each one of them and they're following the exact same Bible?
Now that would be pretty strong evidence.
That would be enough for me. I would have to seriously.
I'd only have to get a couple hundred.
Does human Jesus atone for aliens, or do they need alien Jesus too?
Who's going to share the gospel with them?
Alien Jesus.
It would be the
One of the
Mormons are
most
right.
interesting parts of your chapter that I appreciated, that I resonated with, was the firing squad analogy. I've read about it before, but the piece that piqued my thinking was that if everybody missed just slightly, right, that would be more in tune with a kind of a naturalistic explanation. But if everybody missed by, a long ways, then there would be purpose behind that, right? And you or your co-author make the argument that we probably are not in a fine-tune, in a naturalistic situation because there's more chances for things to be good. Well, you can explain.
It's more finely tuned than is necessary.
Okay, so yeah. So it's interesting because even before I read the chapter, I was thinking through the fine-tuning argument, and I thought, in my little mind, I was thinking that if the universe was full of life and all kinds of different planets, that would be too generous. Fine-tuning would be too generous. But if we have just very rare life, like on the Earth and maybe a few other places at the most, that would be an indication that it was a close miss. You know, those bullets are very close, and it's just fine-tuned just enough to allow life to exist. So I'm thinking, I'm coming to the opposite conclusion of what you're trying to argue by the fact that life is so rare in the universe, that fine-tuning was just enough to allow it to happen on our planet, and maybe a few other places.
The thing is, though, I think it gets complicated, right? Let's suppose God did put a life-permitting planet with every star, and then we start traveling and killing each other because, racism is a problem here in this Earth, right? Imagine how much worse it might be if you have different species, and God could have
We're
any
assuming
number
these
of
other
reasons.
planets are falling also.
Yeah, or maybe they're too good and God wants to protect them, so let's put them far away from these humans, There could be any number of reasons we don't know about, but actually in our book, we don't really deal with the Hugh Ross kind of environmental factors. We're just looking at physics itself. We're not looking at the environmental factors. So we're not really interacting with how common or rare life might be within the universe, but simply making the point that's very well established physics that you wouldn't have life anywhere in the universe of any kind if you didn't have these finely tuned parameters and initial conditions.
Right, but if there was a multiverse, the chances would be that if we end up to talk about this or think about it, that we would be in a universe that just barely had enough qualities
Enough of the qualities,
to allow
yeah.
life to get off the ground. See what I'm saying? So I don't see it as overly generous. I don't see fine tuning as being overly generous. I see it as being just enough. You see how difficult it is for life to get off. We can't even make life as humans with all our intelligence. So you have to have a very huge universe to get even one planet like ours to have.
Not if you have a creator God that could create life from non-life.
Well, I think too, if you go back to the 50s, 60s, I don't know the date if it was, the Urey Miller experiment, where you had a pretty significantly concentrated effort to come up with some more, was it proteins or amino acids, and so they got, there was,
they didn't get anything.
They didn't get really anything, but they did create something, but they set up an environment to where it yielded some amino acids, and it was a conducted, deliberate, purposeful environment in which they got a result pretty quickly. And I think that you could say the same thing. You don't necessarily, on naturalism, you don't necessarily have to have a big universe. You could just get it right the first time. So there's nothing that says on naturalism that the universe has to be huge, that I have to have these potentialities. It looks more like a Urey Miller experiment where the contraption was set up and they got a result pretty quickly. But on naturalism, I don't see that you would have to have all this potentiality for life to exist. You could have a bang, there it is, first try, first shot. Naturalism doesn't tell you which one to expect. You could have got it right on the quote first try.
I think it's intuitive. We know it's very unlikely for life to arise naturalistically, so you have to have lots of opportunities for it, either by having lots of multiverses like you're talking about, or a big universe.
I think you're right about that, Ken. I think we know enough about life, and it's improbable that certainly on naturalism you would need a lot of probabilistic resources one way or the other to have
for all we know, there could be billions of universes out there, none of which have life. There could be trillions of planets in our universe, none of which have life. Maybe we're the only one, and we're just here to talk about it. So
that is the proposal by atheist physicists who...
We have a question here, but first, before we go to that one, if we get back in the back, and if you could talk up so we can get it on the mic.
Throw a quick number, so pardon me if I'm off a little bit. If I recall, the mass density fine-tuning is 10 to the 59th, I believe, right? Which I think it was Hugh Ross that equated to basically the equivalent of a grain of sand or a grain of rice. Now, would that tie into the actual size of the universe? Because if that's how much specifically density you needed, I think he made the argument that that's why everything is really so big that you couldn't have it any other way going with those numbers. And then the next part of the question, because I'll double up on you because I want to sit back down, is a little bit more obscure. My understanding when you get into multiverse and M theory, to get there, this one I'm kind of fuzzy, so I could be totally wrong, but they kind of create two extra dimensions that are sort of imaginary, if you will. And in those dimensions, they postulate that you can create any laws of physics that you want in them because they're down by a quantum state. I'm wondering if I had that right, and if there is any basis at all that don't want to be a pessimist on that, but it just seems like somebody's trying to get somewhere and they're figuring out a way to weasel their way
Yeah, what do you think of that?
Yeah, let me address that. So, string theory started off a number of decades ago. I remember hearing Steven Weinberg talk about it when I was at UT Austin as an undergrad, and I was like, wow, this seems really strange. But at that time, there was a lot of hype. But over time, and eventually it morphed into what is now called M theory, and it does posit 11 spatial dimensions. And these are compactified so that you only have 3 large spatial dimensions that we see.
And that's the only way to make the math work. You have to have those dimensions.
That's right. And we have no evidence for any dimensions beyond the 3. Now, it could be true, but a lot of the enthusiasm for string theory / M theory has really subsided within the physics community. There's some people that are very strong, adamant against it. Peter Voigt at Columbia, and Lee Smolin and others think it's been a colossal waste of effort, but other people are still kind of optimistic, but even they've had to back down because for one thing, it requires something called supersymmetry, which was expected in the Large Hadron Collider but not seen. And so there's kind of been some setbacks, shall we say, but the thing, yeah, M theory would potentially give you the ability to vary constants in these other universes, but it doesn't necessarily give you more than one universe. For that, you need another speculative theory that we also don't have evidence for, and that also requires fine-tuning to produce those other universes. So I think the whole thing, even if it's true, is not a good explanation for the fine-tuning.
I'm just wondering where they got these other dimensions from, because it just seems really kind of...
It's just a proposal that there was some legitimate things when they looked at certain oscillatory things that could be true in fundamental physics, could give you a universe like ours. It might be a way to unite gravity with the other forces. But over time, they've hit all these setbacks and they keep having to sort of move the goalposts. And the bottom line is it's very speculative. They can't even write down the equations for the theory, and we have no real evidence for it. It's made no unique predictions. And then you need not just that, but these other aspects to get an explanation for fine-tuning.
What's the attraction of it? Why is it something that...
There's some beautiful math in it, and they furthered mathematics, and I think originally, at least, there was more reason for thinking, wow, this is almost so beautiful it might be true, which itself is kind of interesting how that beauty has been a guide to truth in physics, which I think sits really well under theism.
So, someone else had a question?
Yes.
I was just going to
Speak up, Melita.
Dr. John Lennox did a wonderful mathematical assessment, but in a layman level, because I'm not a professional mathematician, looking at M theory. And he said there is a problem that even the proponents of M theory have to acknowledge, which is if this is true, and they have to use what they call imaginary numbers to get the other dimensions, and if I understand this correctly, correct me if I'm wrong. Eventually what you have is this sort of perpetuating multiverse is not just more than one but unlimited or infinite verse, because it builds on itself to the point that this is a possibility within the math. And if it does, it means everything is possible, which brings you right back to then God is possible. And it kind of, you end up with coming right back to the start. And so it actually can defeat itself mathematically.
That's a good point.
So it's just are
think
you familiar with that position?
Yeah, that you might be referring, I think, to eternal inflation is the theory that would create this infinite number of universes.
Bubble, bubble, and there's nothing to stop it.
So that's kind of distinct from M theory,
everything
but
is probable, and then everything becomes possible, and then we're right back to
Is it more than possible if there's an infinite number of universes, everything that could exist must exist?
Exactly. And
so there's a universe in which the Cowboys win the Super Bowl every year?
Yes. In fact, there was a peer-reviewed article by Alexander Vilenkin in which he said Elvis is still alive and Al Gore is president. It was right after that time, and he was talking about how all that would be true, literally, and you would have pink unicorns that fly.
So let me ask you guys a question. Your commitment to Christianity, especially you, Ray. I mean, you are like super. You know, when I first became a Christian, you go and you level off, you take it down a notch. You know, you become lukewarm. Man, you just haven't stopped. Baby. So, don't you think your commitment, yours too, obviously, commitment to Christianity, your a priori commitment is coloring, biasing your observations?
It's the opposite for me, actually, because I went through a severe period of doubts, and it was evidence like fine-tuning that really helped me come back to believing in God.
But let's just take the Bible. The Bible couldn't even get the first verse right. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Wrong. The stars were formed many years before Earth. As we admitted, you said 13.7 billion for the universe, and you agreed with this, 4.5 billion for the Earth. So did it not get it wrong?
But no, it doesn't say when they were created.
Didn't you say the heavens first?
And aren't the stars part
No,
of it?
in the beginning,
Stars. I'm gonna chime in with a
Okay, go
biblical
ahead.
studies point. There's just a title
Sure,
that
sure.
says this section is talking about the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth. It's not giving a temporal.
But
order to
it's
anything.
more than that. If you look at the cosmology of the Bible, they believed in a metal dome, I think the Hebrew word is rock or whatever, which is
Sure.
a thin metal, where you had holes to let water in and light in, and the stars were on this metal dome. You have a primitive goat herders, which you guys are trying to, make true.
That's not.
Well, wait a minute. Well, let me talk about the firmament, because the
Yeah,
firmament.
please do, because the young earth creation has held on to it because it had such explanatory power. And by the way, the firmament was the ocean of water above this dome. I mean, it's just nuts, but they only recently gave it up.
It's true that in ancient cosmologies they did have that view, but I don't think you could say the Genesis author had it, because in Genesis 1:14 he talks about the birds flying in the firmament. So I think that's just a misunderstanding.
So this is the concept of the rakia, if you look in Genesis, is nothing more than an expanse. The word firmament came from the Latin translation, the Vulgate, from Jerome. Thank you, Jerome. It was the worst word he could have possibly put in there. It really was. Firmament is not an accurate thing, really, to describe what's going on. What you have in the rakia is simply an expanse. So there's this.
Rakia doesn't mean expanse, it means hard metal that's been beaten down.
Yeah. Well, it can have the connotation.
You don't have birds flying through that.
No.
Obviously, the author, there's a range of meanings for most of those ancient
in
Hebrew
Genesis.
words.
Also, there's holes in it where God lets the water down for Noah.
Well, that's why they loved it, because it solved that
The
problem.
rakia in Genesis, I'm referring to the way in contextual it's using in Genesis, that God has done two things. He has taken the water down here and separated it from the water up here. Now, exactly what this is, people talk about this all the time, but in the middle of that is the expanse. It is empty, and God put stars into the expanse. And so the rakia is filled with the sun, the moon, and the stars for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. So Paul talks about the third heaven in the New Testament. And so there's the clouds, the sky, the stars, and then God's throne room. But the rakia is the separation of waters, and in between that separation, God fills it with light for signs and for seasons and for days and for years.
Well, speaking of light, in the Genesis account, it has the sun created on the first day, and the earth created on the first day, the sun created on the fourth day. Completely opposite of what science tells us.
Well, the light, God says, let there be light. So if you look at who the person of Christ is throughout the New Testament and Old Testament, you have, he's the light of the world. I mean, not light in terms of truth.
So he's given the light in between the 3 days?
And in John, so if we go back to John, if we use John to interpret Genesis, the Genesis, God says that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness did not comprehend or master it. So there was an allowance of light. It doesn't say, if I'm correct, Alan, it doesn't say bara when God makes the first light. He declares that light is, but it's not the same kind of bara that he does when he makes stars.
Well, let me tell you,
So-
Hugh Ross saw this problem, and he goes, "This is totally wrong." he goes, oh, how can I get out of this? Oh, I get it. The atmosphere was translucent and they couldn't see the sun. Have you heard that explanation?
I have heard that.
I mean, it's this exegetical gymnastics that causes us to lose faith in them.
Sorry, can I just interrupt here? We always try to go back, some people here, I won't name names, always want to go back to, biblical contradictions and stuff. I think that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about that God create the universe, not his Genesis.
Yeah.
But they're Christians.
Yeah, but our argument.
Christian, that doesn't mean
Our conversation
Oh, okay, so we can just say, forget it. Hey, I don't worry
Hang on a
about it.
second. That doesn't mean you have to take Genesis as a literal scientific explanation of how the universe
But here's
was
the
created.
problem. If you have those 3 days and you try to cram millions of years in those 3 days, then you don't have any light for like millions of years. That's the problem. If you have the birds on day 3, the plants on day 3, and then you don't have pollination till the birds till day 4, and you cram millions of years in there, then you got a huge problem because you don't have any pollination.
George, George, make a comment.
So, Bill, your questions, your objections, I think, are coming from trying to take a, modern, post-scientific age, Western kind of a mindset and just cram it onto an ancient text and then laughing at it when it doesn't work. When really, I
Well, you're catching on.
I don't think we should expect at all the biblical text to be answering these sorts of questions.
It's the Word
So
of
it's
God.
not that important.
It wasn't the
No, no, no,
intent
no, no,
of the
no.
author, though, to give us scientific details in that text.
Well, thank goodness, because they sure didn't.
They did.
Bill, in
Yeah,
fact,
yeah.
there's very disparity between the sun and the light. There are 2 sets of 3. There's there's light, and then later on there's luminary things that are parallel, and then the second set is like the
It's
land.
called the framework hypothesis,
Right.
which has the kings and kingdoms, which has never caught on.
What I
I'm
would
not sure.
recommend, if you,
I know,
this is a little
kings
bit
and
off topic, but if you want to get into
I know,
that,
it's
you need to read books by C. John Collins. He's a Hebrew scholar, 2 MIT degrees. He has a really good way of explaining how to interpret Genesis. I think
Yeah, there's
you would
the
find
6
more
days
fair.
that divide the world is another book that.
Well, you basically got 3: Old Earth, Young Earth, and you're Old Earth, right?
I am.
And framework. And if
Well,
you have
there's a
Old
lot
Earth,
more than that,
Let me just-
actually.
So if we could try to, let me just say this: if we could try to keep the conversation on the book and what we're trying to deal with, most of the issues we're talking about here, if not one word of the Bible is true, it doesn't affect what we're talking about. So what the conversation is here.
With the Bible. Yeah, I just.
Well, no, I mean, we can stop and talk about
Yeah.
the order of the Gospels or which Gospel came first and all, but it's really off topic to what
I mean,
we're
if
trying to talk
everybody in
about
this
tonight.
room will admit, okay, God exists, then we could move on to another topic. But it seems like there's still some work to do on that more fundamental question.
Yeah, among the non-believers in this group, I'm probably one of the least hardline atheist type person.
He's very
I was
nice.
a deist. I was a deist for a while, and
Okay.
if you prove to me that fine tuning is the only theism is the only way to explain fine tuning, well, I'm not opposed to accepting the idea that there's a deistic God, but it's a huge leap back to the biblical faith that I once had. I mean, there's so many
Admittedly,
insurmountable
sure.
difficulties.
And by the way, guys, good luck trying to get in these Baptist churches because I've been to them. They are 6,000. Ken Ham has crammed 6,000 years down their throat. And do you have any plans to
I
try
go
to
to a Baptist
educate them?
church, and I lead an apologetics group at a Baptist church, and I haven't really had problems. So
Well, let me tell you, you go to a lot of them and you'll have
there's
big
some
problems.
individuals that have said stuff to me, but it's,
Oh, really? What they
yeah.
said?
Well, just the kind of stuff you're referring to. Maybe their only input has been Ken Ham or ICR, so they're kind of nervous about me a little bit. But overall, I've gotten very positive feedback, and the staff.
Well, I used to
I'll
go
go ahead
let me
and
say
admit
this.
and acknowledge, and you guys can
Well,
ridicule us all you want. All Christians don't agree on everything.
Well, no,
I know the atheists do,
Real-
but we don't.
Well, I mean, I sort of see it like, to me, the idea that the Earth is young is such a discredited theory that anybody who proposes it, I have a hard time accepting anything they say.
But the
So
atheists
it's
have
just
their mythicists also.
That's exactly what you just stole what I was just about to say.
Yeah.
I think that both sides set them up for failure in reaching the other side by embracing things that are patently untrue.
And that doesn't mean, Bill, that we don't want to talk about that ever in the book club. And those are good topics. We deal a book that's dealing with that topic or something like that, like little mythicism. I wouldn't try to defeat Carl Sagan by pointing out the error of mythicism.
Well, no,
because it's
here's the thing,
apples and
James.
oranges.
These guys have really good arguments. I mean, I really enjoy listening to them. I enjoyed my time. Daniel was just amazing the hour I talked to him before the meeting. But here's the thing. The guys with the money And the guys, look at the Creation Museum. Go 20 miles down the road. ICR, Institute for Creation Research. These are the guys that are setting the tone. Am I not right, Chris? For the churches
They're
throughout.
trying to set the tone.
They are setting the thing. 40% of the population believes the earth and universe is 6,000 years old. Don't you find that
It's a
ridiculous?
tragedy.
I mean, of course, I think the evidence is pretty clear, and I think the Bible doesn't demand the young ages that people think they do, but I don't want to disparage my fellow believers who probably haven't ever read John Collins or seen the scientific evidence, either one, so.
A lot of us are Lutherans and Presbyterians and other things, and we're
Yeah,
not.
you're cool, yeah.
Well, I'm just saying, that hardline thing you're taking is not necessarily representative.
Oh, no, absolutely not. Yeah, Methodists, they could care less, and Catholics are way off.
Earth is not what we're discussing. I'm sorry, but I'd really like to get back to the book.
I've got a book question.
Back to the book.
Okay,
Book question. This one's for Daniel, because it was your colleague who wrote the chapter on C.S. Lewis, right?
Yeah.
So that chapter talks a lot about, oh, it's a shame we use space because it kind of takes the magic out of things. It takes the imaginative aspects of it out of things, I guess. So my question for you is, how do you think we can find a right balance between a sort of scientific over-reductionism on one hand that reduces everything to its physical components, and over here on the other hand where we're finding fairies behind every rock, like in the pre-modern worldview? Like, how do we find the balance there?
I think, George, it's an excellent question, and I've had a couple of interviews where I've dealt directly with that. C.S. Lewis wasn't just trying to get us to change our minds about the way we use a word. There was a whole conceptual framework in which he was trying to shift people's brains. He was working against George Orwell and the science fiction of his time, so he tried to use imaginative literature. I mean, Lewis was gifted on 3 levels. He was a professional literary scholar, he was an apologist, as you know, and he wrote children's literature, and he also wrote science fiction. But the direct answer to your question, George, is more incarnate engagement with creation. Because even in the hierarchy of modern cosmology, there are a ton of theoretical cosmologists who don't observe anything. They just crunch numbers on computers. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not condemning that. But the idea, just to give you a perspective, we talked about the Kepler Space Telescope Planet Hunter. We've discovered a couple of thousand planets. Some of them are in the habitable zone. And there's, we can't tell what's on them, but they're kind of Earth-like. So there's that observational science. And then there's the theoretical cosmology. We don't know if there's life on those planets, but then you have theoretical cosmologists saying, there's a few of you, George, out there, and you're behind the table, I'm asking you a question, or Alan's a girl, or, James has got 3 wives in Saudi Arabia.
Your Mormonism comes through. True Mormon.
So, but look at the contrast: the observational science versus the theoretical science. And a lot of times, and this was my passion with the book, that we have to take the universe, unpack it out of a syllogism, and go outside and experience it. But because most of us live under the canopy of light pollution, we don't see the Milky Way. We can't name stars. We don't even know what the universe looks like with our own 2 eyes. There was an earthquake in Los Angeles in the late 90s, and the power went out. And people looked up and were calling 911 because they didn't know what was in the sky. And so the balance needs to be that, I'd like to see theoretical cosmologists, like, I'm going to pick on Sarah here, she'll admit it. Sarah Salviander doesn't know stars or constellations. And I have a fun punning joke with her about that. And there's a whole field, and I read a book by a gentleman who had a doctorate in cosmology, and he never got taught anything about constellations or lore. So the incarnate participation and engagement with nature, that's why you had such brilliant natural philosophers 500 years ago who could talk about botany and science and medicine and name stars and constellations and trees and birds, and they were fantastic. Robert Boyle or anybody you can think of, Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo. They were conversant in all kinds of other things. We need more interdisciplinary engagement with creation. And we've just categorized, here's the science box, here's the humanities box, and the 2 shall never meet.
Yeah.
That's why I did the Hubble Narnia thing, because these 2 people need to talk to each other. We need to have the literature people talking to the people who stand behind the telescopes.
Okay, so at this point, I know it seems like we're just getting started, but it's actually time for our break. So we're going to do a 10-minute break and come back at a quarter after. Before we do, we're going to have 2 video clips you're not going to want to miss after the break. And so I'll leave you with that and come back at a quarter after. Thanks so much.
Good advertising.